In a small town in the southern United States, where quiet streets and isolated ranches form the everyday landscape, the CJNG, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, was preparing to expand its territory. However, in a region known as the Forbidden Territory, where no organization dared to venture, an unknown force waited silently. Juan Carlos Ramirez, one of the cartel's youngest and most daring leaders, was eager for more power. The opportunity to dominate virgin territory, rich in resources and without resistance, seemed to be the key to consolidating his position. Through a network of information and infiltrated agents, he had learned of a power vacuum that could be easily filled. However, he was unaware that behind the curtain of shadows, forces more powerful than he imagined were lurking. The city where the CJNG would try to establish itself, though not famous, had a peculiar history. Since the Prohibition era, the place had always been marked by constant tension between local authorities and criminal organizations. But what Juan Carlos didn't know was that the territory was being closely watched by an old family with deep roots in the city, a family that for decades had resisted the powerful, facing hardship, betrayal, and even death. The last of its heirs, Samuel Donovan, a former soldier trained to survive in extreme conditions, now led the family with a single purpose: to protect the city and its secrets. Night fell quickly, and the city lights were out, except for those flickering in the distance, like a lighthouse in a dark sea. As the CJNG invaded the territory, everything seemed to be going well. The silence of the city, the lack of resistance, the feeling that they were about to conquer something valuable. But this feeling was soon interrupted by something Juan Carlos hadn't anticipated: a trap. A group of seemingly ordinary civilians, but with unexpected connections, were preparing a game far more complex than anyone in the cartel could have foreseen. Those empty streets soon became the stage for a relentless hunt. The city, which seemed like easy prey, was in fact a territory well protected by those who knew very well how to fight in the shadows. The town of Hawkins, a transitional point between the desert and the big city, hid its complexities beneath the layer of tranquility that enveloped it. Its dirt streets, surrounded by small farms and ranches, were silent at first glance, but its inhabitants knew they couldn't let their guard down. The territory, which seemed simple at first glance, was full of secrets and dangers that outsiders ignored. Samuel Donovan, a man in his 40s, knew this better than anyone. Raised by his grandfather, a man who had confronted the Mexican cartel several decades ago, Samuel was taught from an early age that survival depended not only on strength, but also on a deep knowledge of the terrain. He was not a leader by choice, but by necessity. The premature death of his parents, victims of a brutal cartel attack, had molded him into a ruthless figure. With a combination of military skills and cunning, he was ready to defend what remained to him: the city and the memory of his family. Samuel's mission was clear: to ensure that history did not repeat itself. He knew that any move by the cartel, especially the CJNG, could mean the destruction of everything he had built. He had infiltrated the community without anyone knowing his true intentions, discreetly gathering information, preparing the ground for an inevitable confrontation. On the other hand, Juan Carlos Ramirez, the young leader of the CJNG, was not only audacious, he was also unpredictable. Born and raised in the heart of Mexico, Juan Carlos grew up in an environment where violence and corruption were the norm. He saw his parents succumb to the cartel's enemies, and the fire of revenge fueled him from childhood. His rise to power within the CJNG was rapid, and his ambition to expand the cartel's territory in the United States made him a figure of respect, but also of fear. Juan Carlos trusted his network of contacts, but he didn't fully understand the dynamics of the territory he was about to invade. He thought Hawkins was just another small town in the countryside, without strategic importance, but with enough to generate large profits. He never imagined that Samuel and his family had the strength and resources necessary to confront such a powerful cartel, and what was supposed to be a simple mission to seize territory would soon become a game of survival, where every misstep could be fatal. As the cartel advanced through the streets, it seemed nothing could stop its progress. But a series of small mistakes, such as the unexpected reactions of civilians, began to raise red flags for Juan Carlos. The locals seemed to know what to do on every corner, giving the impression that the city was waiting for something or someone. Samuel, with his calloused hands and sharp mind, wasn't just waiting. He was creating a network of resistance that could be activated at any moment. The night dragged on, and the town of Hawkins began to transform into an invisible battlefield. The CJNG, led by Juan Carlos, advanced confidently, but the resistance of the residents, disguised as normalcy, soon began to reveal itself. Samuel Donovan knew that his advantage lay in his ability to control the territory, knowing every street, every house, every alley. When the cartel began to spread through the town, he had already put into practice a plan that would not depend solely on physical strength, but on strategic intelligence. The first sign that something was wrong came when the CJNG members began to notice that the streets were too empty. The houses, seemingly unoccupied, were mysteriously locked, and no one was on the street corners. The city somehow seemed alive, as if everyone were watching from inside their homes, waiting for something. Juan Carlos frowned, his confidence wavering slightly, but he believed that control was in his hands. The cartel's power had always been enough to subdue any resistance. However, what he didn't know was that the city was being organized by Samuel into small groups of armed and well-trained civilians. The residents, many of whom had been trained in survival tactics by Samuel for years, were ready to act. The army of civilians, united by the desire to protect their homes and families, spread through the streets, but invisibly. When the cartel tried to make a move, they quickly realized they were being watched, that every step was being monitored. The movements that seemed simple at first were becoming more complicated as the first ambushes began to occur. Tensions intensified when Juan Carlos received the first news that one of his men had been ambushed. The body appeared in the central square, marking the cartel's first death in the territory. The message was clear. This place was not like any other. Samuel was not just any resistance leader. He had an army that knew the terrain better than anyone. Instead of seeking direct confrontation, Samuel used guerrilla tactics, attacking quickly and stealthily, leaving no trace. Every time the CJNG members advanced, they were hit by long-range gunfire, silent explosions, or well-placed traps. Juan Carlos wasn't a fool, and quickly realized he was in a much more complex game than he had imagined. While he and his men tried to control the streets, Samuel was in the shadows, maneuvering with impressive agility. The CJNG was growing increasingly impatient. The deaths began to pile up and troop morale plummeted. Furthermore, there were rumors that other groups, even from outside the city, were beginning to get involved in Hawkins' defense. The situation was spiraling out of control. In a moment of desperation, Juan Carlos called a meeting with his top lieutenants. They needed a solution. The local resistance was proving more difficult than anyone had imagined. It was then that Juan Carlos had the idea to retaliate with full force, sending more men and heavy equipment, such as armored cars and machine guns. But even with the imminent threat, Samuel didn't seem worried. He knew that a direct confrontation would favor the CJNG. The key to victory lay in keeping the cartel away from key areas and using the environment to their advantage. The fight wasn't just for control of the territory, it was for the survival of everyone involved. Both sides knew that what was at stake was more than a simple power struggle. The town of Hawkins wasn't just a strategic location, it was the last refuge of a generation that had resisted for so long. Samuel knew that if he lost, he would be handing over his family's legacy to destruction. For Juan Carlos, it was the opportunity to finally break the resistance that had endured for so long. As the conflict between the CJNG and the Hawkins resistance intensified, small tensions began to emerge within the ranks of both sides. On Samuel's side, although the town was united by the need to resist, not everyone was entirely in agreement with his tactics. Some residents, especially the older ones, feared that his struggle might attract even more violence to the town. Samuel's old stone house, where he had grown up, became the meeting point for advisors and allies, but it was also the place where arguments heated up. Lena, a woman of indomitable spirit and a loyal follower of Samuel, was one of the strongest voices in the resistance. She believed that the only way to defeat the CJNG was to use the same method: infiltration and psychological manipulation. Her plan was to infiltrate the cartel's ranks, destroy its communication networks, and cause confusion within the organization itself. Samuel was reluctant to accept this idea. He didn't fully trust traitors, and although he respected Lena, he knew that a mistake in this mission could be fatal for everyone. But Lena wasn't willing to wait. With the help of some allies, she began infiltrating the cartel's supply chain, cutting off its supply lines and hindering the CJNG's movements. Although her mission was initially successful, it brought with it a series of unexpected problems. The CJNG, increasingly suspicious of the city, began to violently pressure the residents, torturing some to obtain information about the traitors who were interfering with their plans. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, a more personal subplot began to unfold. Maria, one of the city's youngest women and sister of one of Samuel's fighters, began to grow close to Carlos, one of the CJNG lieutenants who, unlike his superiors, didn't seem fully integrated into the cartel's brutality. Tired of the violence, he questioned Juan Carlos's orders and the mission in Hawkins. Their relationship, initially a search for information, soon transformed into something deeper. Maria and Carlos, both risking their lives for different reasons, began to develop a secret bond that threatened to further destabilize the already fragile structures on both sides. Meanwhile, the CJNG members themselves were beginning to question what they were really doing there. The promise of power and wealth seemed empty in the face of the senseless violence they faced every day. Juan Carlos, consumed by his thirst for revenge and power, had overlooked a fundamental fact. The cartel's own men were beginning to doubt the mission. Rumors of the unbeatable resistance in Hawkins were spreading, and many within the CJNG feared their lives were at stake. Over time, tensions began to extend beyond the city limits. Samuel and his allies knew the cartel wouldn't give up easily, but they also knew that if they could spread the conflict to other regions, they could weaken Juan Carlos's power. Secret contacts with groups outside of Hawkins were being made, and a new network of allies was forming, ready to attack the CJNG at multiple points simultaneously. Samuel was determined to show that, even as a small town, Hawkins could be a symbol of resistance against the cartel's oppression. However, the price of all this was beginning to show. Deaths were increasing, trust among the residents was crumbling, and each new move seemed to heighten the tension. Samuel, though in control of the city, knew that time was running out. The fight wasn't just against the CJNG, but against the very ghosts that haunted his family's legacy. The pressure was beginning to weigh on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The atmosphere in Hawkins was more tense than ever. The town, which for so long seemed a remote and ignored place, was becoming the epicenter of a conflict that no one could have predicted. The CJNG, without fully understanding the terrain and the population, was increasingly frustrated. The local resistance, led by Samuel, had inflicted a series of heavy losses, but even so, the cartel did not seem willing to back down. What seemed to be a war of attrition was about to turn into a direct and devastating confrontation. It was during a silent dawn, when the clock on the old city church struck 3, that the turning point occurred. Samuel received crucial information through a coded message he had managed to intercept. A massive CJNG operation was being planned, a coordinated invasion aimed not only at defeating the resistance, but at completely destroying the city, leaving it in ruins. For this, they would have heavy military support, including helicopters and even state-of-the-art firearms, something Samuel had never anticipated. But the real surprise came when the message included a name: Carlos. Carlos, the CJNG lieutenant who had become involved with Maria and who, in everyone's eyes, seemed to be a mere pawn, was in a crucial strategic position. He had become a key player in the operation aimed at attacking the city from all sides. This meant that he was no longer just a soldier of the cartel. He was deeply involved in Juan Carlos's plans. What began as a simple espionage relationship had transformed into something much more complicated. Samuel had known about Carlos and Maria's relationship, but he hadn't imagined that it would turn Carlos into a traitor. The revelation that he was behind the final attack on Hawkins was a direct blow to the heart of the resistance. Lena, who had staked everything on the infiltration strategy, was devastated to learn that the information she had received was actually manipulation orchestrated by Carlos. Samuel, though suspicious of Carlos from the start, had never imagined he was capable of becoming so deeply involved with the enemy. The thought that his own city, his own struggle, was being betrayed by one of his own was a psychological blow that shook his confidence and leadership. However, what Samuel didn't know was that Carlos, after months of living with the resistance and his relationship with Maria, was having his own internal dilemmas. The man who had initially followed Juan Carlos's orders was beginning to question not only his loyalty to the cartel, but his own humanity. For weeks, he'd been torn between two worlds, that of Juan Carlos's ruthless orders and that of the town of Hawkins, where he somehow felt at home. The truth is that Carlos was, in fact, getting closer and closer to an impossible choice. The breaking point came when Carlos, in an unexpected move, alerted Samuel about the massive invasion operation. He not only provided strategic details about the cartel's plans, but also revealed a secret. The operation would be launched before dawn, and the CJNG was preparing a series of large-scale traps, including explosives and airstrikes. Carlos, with a mixture of guilt and regret, made an irrevocable decision. He was betraying Juan Carlos, but at the same time, he was redeeming himself in the eyes of Samuel and all the residents of Hawkins. Carlos's revelation shifted the balance of power in Hawkins. Although he was still a CJNG officer and his involvement in the attack was undeniable, Samuel knew he needed to act quickly. With the information Carlos provided, Samuel began to mount a defense for the city, adjusting his strategies to face an enemy that was now more prepared and motivated than ever. The attack, which seemed irreversible, could still be stopped, but the city would need to be more united than ever. Meanwhile, the relationship between Carlos and Maria became even more intense and complicated. Maria, torn between her love for a man who now seemed to be a traitor and her loyalty to the city, faced an internal battle that consumed her. Her love for Carlos was genuine, but she knew he was immersed in a world of violence and corruption. She didn't know if she could forgive him for his role in the impending attack, but she knew that if she wanted to save Hawkins, she would need to trust Carlos, at least for now. Dawn brought with it an almost palpable tension. The streets of Hawkins, which had previously seemed tranquil, were now permeated with a collective fear. Samuel and his allies had only a few hours to prepare the city for the imminent attack. Carlos's words, though incomplete, had given them the necessary advantage, but the city was far from safe. The traps the cartel was setting were like a nightmare approaching at breakneck speed, and the clock was ticking. Samuel, with his usual calm, made his way to the central square where the villagers were gathered. He looked at each of them, knowing that no matter how well-trained or well-armed they were, the battle would be brutal. He had lost so much to get this far, and what was at stake now was more than just the survival of Hawkins. It was the survival of his family's memory and what they represented. He needed to ensure that the sacrifice of so many would not be in vain. Lena, his chief advisor and strategist, was by his side. She had unwavering confidence in Samuel's abilities, but Carlos's revelation and the betrayal of one of his own allies had left her emotionally fragile. The trust she had placed in Carlos now seemed a mistake, but she knew that in times of war, difficult decisions had to be made. Loyalty, as well as betrayal, no longer carried the same weight. What mattered was victory, and she would do whatever it took to ensure the city remained standing. Maria, her heart torn between her love for Carlos and the obligation to protect her city, knew her struggle was even more internal. She spent sleepless nights reflecting on her encounters with Carlos, trying to understand if he was truly on the right side or if he was merely playing a survival game. She didn't know if she could forgive him for his involvement in the attack, but she knew that without him, the city would be doomed. The pain of having to make such a difficult decision wouldn't leave her in peace. Meanwhile, Carlos, now more distant from Juan Carlos than ever, felt the weight of his choices. Although he was helping the resistance, he still knew that his actions could not be erased. His loyalty to the cartel had been, until that moment, a fundamental part of his identity. But what he had done for Maria and for Hawkins' future could not be undone. He was on a thin line between redemption and condemnation, and the fear that his betrayal would be discovered at any moment hung over him like a shadow. The CJNG attack, which had been planned as a ruthless invasion, was now underway. As the cartel's first helicopters began to fly over the city, Samuel and his allies were positioned in strategic areas that had been reinforced with barricades and traps. The city, which at first glance seemed peaceful and defenseless, was now prepared to face one of the greatest challenges in its history. The battle began swiftly and violently. The first explosions echoed through the fields and streets, and the sound of gunfire reverberated through the streets of Hawkins. Juan Carlos's men, confident in their numerical superiority, began to advance, but soon realized they had been deceived. The traps and ambushes prepared by Samuel and his allies proved more effective than anyone could have imagined. The streets, which had previously seemed deserted, were now filled with armed civilians fighting to protect their homes. The CJNG, accustomed to quickly overpowering its targets, was now being repelled by an unknown and unforeseen force. Amidst the chaos, Carlos, who had infiltrated the cartel's lines, had to make a definitive decision. He was among the CJNG fighters, but he knew that any move could reveal his position. However, the need to show his loyalty to the city and to Maria compelled him to act. At a crucial moment, he used clandestine communication to alert Samuel to the exact location of the cartel reinforcements that were arriving. His action, though desperate, helped turn the tide of the battle. But for every victory the resistance achieved, there was a loss. The human cost was immense, and the city Samuel had sworn to protect was being slowly destroyed. He knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that if they didn't win, everything he loved would be lost forever. The sounds of battle echoed throughout the city. Hawkins, once just an isolated refuge, was now scarred by war. The streets were littered with rubble, the once imposing buildings were partially destroyed. But in the heart of the city, something new was being forged. Samuel, Lena, Maria, and even Carlos, with their inner struggles and dilemmas, had transformed in the face of adversity. Samuel, more than ever, faced an immense challenge. It wasn't just about protecting the city or his family's memory, but about saving the very essence of who he was. During the battle, he was forced to make difficult decisions. many of them painful. He knew that to win, he would have to make sacrifices, not only of his own safety, but of the people around him. The man he was before this war, the man who relied solely on the strength of his leadership and his strategic skills, had given way to a leader who knew how to listen, who understood the value of collaboration and mutual trust. The fight for the city had become more than a matter of survival. It had become a journey of personal transformation. Samuel, who had often been driven by the need for revenge and the pain of loss, began to see that true strength came not from brutality or the thirst for power, but from the ability to protect others, to lead with heart, and to make personal sacrifices for a greater good. The city of Hawkins, with all its flaws and limitations, had become his reason for living, not just as a symbol, but as a place he loved. Lena, for her part, underwent an equally profound transformation. Known for her coldness and relentless focus on strategy, she had always believed that victory came from reason and logic. But what she discovered on the battlefield challenged her entire worldview. Love, loyalty, and the human spirit were as powerful as any weapon. Although her mind remained sharp, she now understood that the best plans don't just arise from tactics, but from the unity of a community. She learned to trust the people around her more, to understand that not everyone fights for the same reason, but everyone has something to offer. Maria, the young woman consumed by her love for Carlos, also underwent a transformative journey. The dilemma of loving someone involved with the enemy tore her apart. But what Maria realized throughout the conflict was that sometimes love isn't enough to save a person. She had to let go of her illusions and accept that true strength came from her own capacity for decision-making. Her fight was no longer just for Carlos's love, but for the survival of her city, her family, and her identity. When she saw Carlos risk his life to warn Samuel about the cartel's movements, she knew he had chosen his side, but that didn't mean she could forget what he had done. Carlos, a man torn between two worlds, had his own journey of redemption. His relationship with Samuel and the resistance in Hawkins forced him to confront the shadows of his past. The Carlos who had entered the city in uniform with a clear mission to follow Juan Carlos's orders was transforming. The battle was no longer just a matter of survival for him, but a fight for his soul. He had been corrupted by years of violence and betrayal, but his act of betraying his own cartel, of helping Samuel and Maria, showed that he could still choose a different path. His evolution wasn't instantaneous, but with each step he took, he left behind a piece of the man he once was. The city, while struggling to resist the cartel's final attack, was also transforming. The fear that once hung over its inhabitants now gave way to hope. What seemed to be a lost city, condemned to succumb to the violence and power of the cartels, now stood against the impossible. Hawkins' resistance was not just a fight against the CJNG, it was a fight for the soul of each of its inhabitants, for the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity, to resist when all seemed lost. As the day wore on and the CJNG forces began to retreat, Samuel watched his allies and friends with a renewed perspective. They had faced the chaos together, and more than that, they had evolved together. Those who were in Hawkins were no longer just residents or combatants. They were a family united by pain, loss, and ultimately, victory. The sun was beginning to set, tinging the sky red and orange, as if foreshadowing what was to come. The town of Hawkins, despite having bravely resisted the CJNG attack, was still far from safe. The residents were tired, wounded, but determined. The fight was far from over, and the greatest challenge was yet to come. The cartel's final attack, the offensive that would give Juan Carlos total control over the city, or, if Samuel and his allies succeeded, change the course of the conflict forever. Samuel gathered the last of his allies in the old community hall, which now served as the Resistance's command center. The atmosphere was heavy, Every face showed the weariness of weeks of fighting. But there was also something resolute in each person's gaze, a determination that stemmed from what they were defending. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the memory of a town that had become more than just a piece of land. Hawkins was a symbol of resistance, of unity, and Samuel knew he couldn't fail now. Lena, beside him, studied maps and attack plans. Her knowledge of the terrain and her ability to anticipate the enemy's movements were crucial to success. But something had changed in her since the previous days. Her strategic coldness had now given way to something more human, something deeper. The war had forced her to see the people around her not just as pieces in a game, but as human beings, each with their own story and their own losses. She now fully trusted Samuel, but also felt a greater weight when making decisions. Maria, her heart heavy with doubt, still stood by Carlos's side. He, now fully committed to the resistance, was determined to do his part in the final assault. Although her love for him was undeniable, she knew the battle wouldn't be easy, not only against the CJNG, but against the very ghosts Carlos carried with him. Maria knew he was trying to redeem himself, but she also knew the scars of his betrayal couldn't be erased so easily. Her fight now was as much to save Hawkins as it was to save the man she loved, even if it meant making personal sacrifices she never imagined. Carlos, for his part, was more determined than ever. His journey of redemption had transformed him. He knew he couldn't erase what he had done, but he had an opportunity to write a new story for himself, a story of action, of courage, of doing what was right. He had made his decision, and he was ready to pay the price for his choices. The loyalty he once had to the cartel was now completely eradicated. He was no longer a soldier of Juan Carlos, but a defender of Hawkins. This was more than he could have dreamed. He was ready to face the cartel leader head-on, knowing it would be his last battle. The CJNG reinforcements, which were still on their way, were numerous and well-armed. Juan Carlos, aware that his cartel was in a position of power, knew that the resistance was far from defeated. His army was stronger than ever, and he was willing to destroy Hawkins completely if necessary, to ensure that no place in the world could challenge his authority. Preparations were at their peak. Samuel and his team were organizing their last defenses, but the city was exhausted and resources were limited. Resistance could not continue for much longer. They needed to act now, before it was too late. The city was surrounded, and the final battle was imminent. That night, before the final assault, Samuel gathered the resistance leaders one last time. He looked at each of them, realizing that it wasn't just the fate of Hawkins that was at stake, but also the future of everyone present. He knew that, regardless of what happened, things would never be the same. But he also knew that this fight was the only chance to secure a future for those he loved. The silence was broken by the arrival of an urgent message. CJNG reinforcements were less than an hour away. Night fell heavily on Hawkins, and the stars, hidden by the smoke and dust of battle, were barely visible. The sound of the wind cutting through the deserted streets was interrupted only by the murmurs of nervousness that permeated the air. Samuel, Lena, Maria, and Carlos were in position, prepared for the confrontation that would determine the fate of the city and their own lives. The resistance had done everything it could, but the CJNG forces, led by Juan Carlos, were about to make their final assault. The battlefield was the heart of the city, where Samuel planned to confront the cartel directly. The city was surrounded, but Samuel knew that if he wanted to give his people one last chance, he needed to attack before the CJNG could organize. The strategy was bold and risky, but it was the only one with a chance of success. He had met with the other resistance leaders, devising a daring plan to deceive the cartel and ensnare them in a deadly trap. The streets of Hawkins would become the scene of a final bloody battle where every second would count. Carlos, who had now distanced himself from his past loyalty to the cartel, stood with Samuel on the front lines. He knew that the final fight would be his redemption, a chance to prove himself not only to the inhabitants of Hawkins, but to himself. Beside Maria, who, with a determined look, had finally accepted that love couldn't save anyone, Carlos prepared for action. There was no more room for doubt. His love for Maria was now fuel for his courage, but he also knew that the final battle wasn't just about saving the town, it was about saving his soul. Lena, beside her, watched the cartel's movements with calculating precision. She understood that the war wasn't just about winning a battle, but about destabilizing the enemy's confidence. The resistance had prepared the city with meticulous traps and strategic points, but everything depended on the element of surprise. Lena knew that if the CJNG attack was successful, nothing else would matter. She was willing to sacrifice everything for that last chance. Hawkins needed to rise up, and she believed that with the right strategy, the resistance could turn the tide. When the first CJNG helicopters flew over the city, sirens blared, and the crack of gunfire mingled with the sound of the wind. Samuel, with a firm gesture, gave the order to attack. The plan was in action. Suddenly, the streets that had seemed tranquil were now filled with explosions and gunfire. The fighting had begun. Carlos and Maria joined a small fighting force, while Samuel, with Lena by his side, led the main resistance movements. The city, which had seemed defenseless, was now becoming an unexpected battlefield for the CJNG soldiers. The traps scattered throughout the city began to show their effect. Cartel vehicles were destroyed by explosions that seemed to appear out of nowhere, catching the invaders by surprise. The city was fighting back, and that was enough to sow doubt within the CJNG ranks. The fight was fierce. Samuel and his men faced the cartel forces with a determination they didn't even know they possessed. The heat of battle, the smell of gunpowder and blood, everything seemed to merge into a single moment of pure chaos. Carlos, in a courageous gesture, confronted one of the cartel leaders, a fierce and merciless lieutenant, while Maria, her eyes fixed on him, prepared to make the most difficult decision of her life. She knew this would be Carlos's last chance at redemption. The battle was no longer just about surviving, but about achieving freedom for both sides. Meanwhile, Lena used her strategy to manipulate the CJNG's movements, creating false directions and distractions. She, a brilliant mind, knew that victory would not come from brute force, but from tactical intelligence. As the battle unfolded, the resistance grew stronger, and the CJNG's morale began to waver. Juan Carlos's army, which had previously seemed invincible, was now being pressured by forces they had not anticipated. The climax arrived when Samuel, with the help of Carlos and Maria, managed to confront Juan Carlos, the leader of the CJNG, in a direct confrontation. The two leaders, each with their own motivations and dark pasts, met in the city center. The words between them were short and tense, each aware that in the end only one would emerge victorious. "You can't win," Juan Carlos said with a cruel smile as he prepared to attack. "But I can guarantee you'll lose," Samuel replied, with a calmness that didn't match the intensity of the battle raging around him. The confrontation between them was swift and brutal, but in the end, it was Samuel who prevailed. Juan Carlos's defeat was a devastating blow to the cartel. Without their leader, the CJNG forces began to fall apart, and the resistance had a chance to seize control of the city. When the last echo of gunfire faded from the streets of Hawkins, a somber stillness enveloped the city. The streets, now stained with blood and ash, were deserted, but in the distance, a small flame of hope began to glimmer. The CJNG, without its leader, was disorganized, and slowly the cartel's last forces were repelled by the resistance. Hawkins' victory was not easy, and certainly not without cost, but the city stood firm. Samuel, though victorious, did not feel immediate relief. The scars of the battle, both physical and emotional, were deep. He looked at those who remained by his side: Lena, Maria, Carlos and many others, and knew that their victory was only part of the story. Hawkins, though free from the cartel's threat, was irrevocably changed. Many lives were lost, and the wounds, both physical and spiritual, would take time to heal. Maria, standing beside Carlos, felt a mixture of emotions. The man she loved, the man who had been her greatest dilemma, was now by her side, bearing the weight of his choices and actions. She knew that although he had redeemed himself, the path to true peace would be long. However, the struggle he had endured, both internally and externally, could not be disregarded. They had a chance now to rebuild their lives, but Maria knew it would never be simpler than that. Carlos's love wouldn't be enough to erase the past, but perhaps it would be enough to give them both a future. Carlos, for his part, felt a mixture of regret and relief. The final battle with Juan Carlos, the cartel leader, had not only been a fight for the city, but also a fight for his own redemption. He knew his journey was far from over. The victory in Hawkins was an important step, but there was still much more he needed to do to forgive himself. Looking at Maria, he knew that despite everything, she was still by his side. Perhaps one day he could rebuild something more solid, but for now he was content knowing he had a chance. Lena, watching the scene from afar, felt the weight of victory on her shoulders. The fight hadn't just been about defeating the cartel. For her, it was about redefining what it meant to be a leader. She had learned to trust others, to put humanity before cold reason. The war had shown her that while strategy was important, true strength came from people uniting for a greater good. The town of Hawkins was saved, but Lena knew that, like Samuel, she too would need time to heal. Hawkins was far from the quiet town it once was, but there was something that could never be taken from them: the strength of their unity. They had faced a relentless enemy and emerged victorious, but the price had been high. Samuel looked at the city that was now beginning to rebuild. He knew the future would be arduous, but he also believed that, with the lessons they had learned, Hawkins could gradually rise again. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was determined to fight for that tomorrow alongside those who had chosen to resist, not only for the city, but for each other. The battle was over, but the real journey was about to begin. Months had passed since the victory in Hawkins, and the city, though still scarred by war, was beginning to breathe again. Samuel, now calmer and more introspective, had become a respected leader, not only for his strategy, but for the humanity with which he guided his city. Lena, by his side, had become his closest ally, helping to rebuild what the battle had destroyed. Maria and Carlos, though far from a perfect ending, found a way to start over. They hadn't forgotten the past, but now, together, they were taking steps toward a personal and communal reconstruction. Hawkins, though wounded, moved forward. What would you do if you were in Samuel, Lena, Maria, or Carlos's place? The fight for survival is not just an external battle, but also an internal journey of choices, sacrifices, and redemption. If this story touched your heart, share your reflections in the comments. What did you learn from the Battle of Hawkins? What lessons would you take into your own life? Don't let the story end here. Share it with your friends, inspire others, and continue the discussion. True victory is not just about winning, but about what we do with what we have left.